Hi, and welcome to Mrs. Long's video lesson on the final chapter of the Picture of Dorian Gray. It's been a pretty long ride, but we are there in the end. So, chapter 20, when the novel comes to its probably inevitable end, and Dorian's inevitable end, takes place as Dorian leaves Lord Henry's house, and he's reflecting on the conversation, and then he arrives at his house and his reflection on the conversation and his life going forward prompts his final act. So he's strolling home smoking. He comes across a group of men who are talking about him. They whisper, "That's Dorian Gray." And he remembers how pleased he used to be when he was pointed out. But again, we get this repeat of this idea. He's tired of hearing his own name. He said to Basil, "I'm tired of talking about myself." He seems to be weary with his life. And so he thinks about what Lord Henry has said. Was it really true one could never change? He felt a wild longing for the unstained purity of his boyhood, his rose-white boyhood, as Lord Henry had once called it. He knew he'd tarnished himself, filled his mind with corruption, and given horror to his fancy, that he had been an evil influence to others, and had experienced a terrible joy in being so, and that of the lives that had crossed his own it had been the fairest and the most full of promise, that he had brought to shame. Interesting moment of self-realization here. But was it all irretrievable? Was there no hope for him? And he says, in what monstrous moment of pride and passion he had prayed that the portrait should bear the burden of his days and keep the unsullied splendor of eternal youth. All his failure had been due to that. Better for him that each of his sin of his life had brought its sure swift penalty along with it. There was purification in punishment, not forgive us our sins, but smite us for our iniquities, should be the prayer of man to a most just God. And what he means there is perhaps that it would have been better if every wrong thing he'd done had had immediate negative consequences. And so he would have been better because he would then have learned from his mistakes. But because this painting had lifted him out of that realm of consequences, he had just continued to be bad. But he realizes this. It's interesting that he can have such honesty at this moment. And so he picks up a mirror that Lord Henry had given him, and previously Dorian had taken great delight and relish in looking and gazing on his own beauty. But in this moment, he loathed his own beauty, and he flings the mirror on the floor, crushed it into silver splinters beneath his heel. It was his beauty that had ruined him, his beauty and the youth that he'd prayed for. But for those two things, his life might have been free from stain. So this is a very important moment when Dorian destroys this mirror, because ultimately now he is rejecting the reflection of his beauty, and it's no longer something that he can look on with joy and delight. It's almost as if instead of the painting mocking him, his own beautiful face is mocking him. And even though he says it's better not to think of the past, he reflects now on all the people's lives that had ended as a result of his actions. James Vane was hidden in a nameless grave in Selby churchyard. Alan Campbell had shot himself one night in his laboratory, but had not revealed the secret that he'd been forced to know, which I think is really interesting, that he'd taken Dorian's secret to his grave. Perhaps he was afraid that Dorian would reveal his secret and his legacy perhaps would have been ruined. Interesting thought. The excitement, such as it was over Basil Hallward's disappearance, would soon pass away. He was perfectly safe there, nor indeed was it the death of Basil that weighed most upon his mind. It was the living death of his own soul that troubled him. Okay, so again, Even though he seems to be having moments of clarity, his motives are still very much selfish. Um, not so much the guilt of Basil's death, but the effect that it's had on his own soul. And again, he repeats this idea that he cannot forgive Basil for creating the painting that marred his life, that transferred responsibility. It was the portrait that had done everything. Um, and of course, I think and this makes us think of the idea of art being sterile, because technically, then that's correct, because the portrait actually hadn't done anything. It was the suggestion and the power of the portrait um, that had allowed Dorian to do everything. Basil had said to him things that were unbearable and that he had borne with patience. The murder had simply been madness of a moment. As for Alan Campbell, his suicide has been his own act. He'd chosen to do it. It was nothing to him. He cannot get rid of his old, even though he's trying to be good, his old habit of transferring blame onto the acts of others and not his influence. He thought of Hetty Merton and began to wonder if the portrait in the locked room had changed. So his one good act now, he believes or hopes, perhaps maybe, he would be able to see some sign of his, turning over this new leaf and deciding to be good. Perhaps if his life became pure, he would be able to expel every sign of evil passion from the face. So, and this is a selfish wish. He doesn't want to be good because of the innate morality of being good. He wants to be good so that he can restore his soul. He would go and look. Yes, he would be good. He felt as if the load had been lifted from him already. And as we round down now to the final act that Dorian performs, it starts off with this cry of pain and indignation as when he looks on the portrait, instead of seeing a change, he sees that there's now a look of cunning in the mouth and the curved wrinkle of the hypocrite. The thing that was still loathsome, more loathsome if possible. The scarlet dew that spotted the hands seemed brighter and more like blood newly spilled. Perhaps Alan Campbell's death is now blood on Dorian's hands too. And so he realizes, or he has to ask himself, the portrait is showing him that he's being a hypocrite. Had it been merely vanity that had made him do one good deed, or desire for a new sensation, as Lord Henry had hinted? So what were his motives actually? Was he doing it just to be good, or was he doing it to save himself? And of course, we know the answer already. Why was the red stain larger than it had been? There was blood on the feet, as though the thing had dripped, blood even on the hand that had not held the knife. So, reference there to the lives that he had caused to end indirectly, perhaps. James Vane, Alan Campbell. Confess? Did it mean he was to confess? No, that idea to him was monstrous, because even if he did confess, who would believe him? And of course, he wouldn't want to confess because then he would have to give himself up and be put to death. And he laughs at this idea. That's absolutely ridiculous. Nothing that he could do would cleanse him till he had told his own sin. His sin, he shrugged his shoulders. The death of Basil seemed very little to him. He was thinking of Hetty Merton, for it was an unjust mirror, the mirror of his soul, that he was looking at. Vanity, curiosity, hypocrisy. Had there been nothing more in his renunciation than that? Through vanity he had spared her, he realizes. In hypocrisy he had worn the mask of goodness. For curiosity's sake he had tried the denial of self. He recognized that now. Right, so another moment of sort of a light bulb moment for Dorian, where he realizes that his being good was not a sincere act, but rather trying something different to see if it had an effect. And then he questions if the murder of Basil was to dog him all his life. Was he really to confess? Why? There was not one bit of evidence against him. Only the picture himself, that was the evidence. He would destroy it. Why had he kept it so long? Once it had given him pleasure to watch it changing and growing old. Of late he had felt no such pleasure. And we remember the description in chapter 11 of the sort of haunting nature of the painting, how it always, wherever he was, he thought about it, and he would often have to rush home to check. The fear of being found out just became something that sort of dogged him his entire life. Its mere memory had marred many moments of joy. It had been like a conscience to him. Yes, it had been a conscience. He would destroy it. Okay. And of course, now we realize the the full circle of the story. If you think back to the chapter 2, where Dorian first looks at the painting and it upsets him, and um, Basil says, "Well, then I'll destroy it. If it makes you unhappy, I'll destroy it." And he takes a palette knife, and Dorian says, "No, Basil, don't. It would be murder." Okay, here we have him finding the knife that he had stabbed Basil with, and it he takes it to the painting, not remembering his words. It would be murder. It would kill the past, and when that was dead, he would be free. It would kill his monstrous soul life, and without its hideous warnings, he would be at peace. He seized the thing and stabbed the picture with it. Now, there's often confusion in people's interpretation of this, but please remember that Dorian's intention was not to kill himself. Dorian's intention was to destroy the painting, and in so kill the thing that had caused him distress, the thing that had haunted him, the reminder of what had happened to his soul. But of course, we realize that Dorian and the painting are so inextricably linked. The painting is him, he is the painting. And so as he stabs the painting, there's a terrible cry and a crash. And eventually, when his servants and the police gained access to the room, they found hanging upon the wall the splendid portrait as they had last seen him. Excuse my dog. Basil. Sorry. Baxter. Shh. Almost called my dog Basil. Um, and so the portrait has been restored to its former glory. And um, lying on the floor was a dead man in evening dress with a knife in his heart. And so we can see now that what Dorian actually did was killed himself because the painting was him. I mean, it seems crazy that he didn't realize what the effect of this would have been, but it was a moment of madness, much like the moment where he took the knife to Basil. And so the man lying on the floor is withered, wrinkled, and loathsome, and the only way that he is recognizable is the rings that Dorian Gray wore. And so that is the end of the story, and we are left wondering all sorts of things about the nature of life, the nature of art, appearance versus reality, the importance of youth and beauty, the responsibility of one's actions, how much of our actions are due to um, our own choices, the influence of others. And these are things that you'll deal with in more depth when you look at your study of the themes and the symbols in the novel. And you can then also discuss your feelings of how it ended, and how do you agree with the end of the story. But I think it's a lovely bookend to the story of Dorian Gray, because this wish that he made for the painting to bear the brunt of his aging and sin, it seems as if there was no other way for the story really to end than for Dorian and the painting to be linked. I mean, it was a soul link. He said it was this thing that represented his soul. So they couldn't exist one without the other. And perhaps the greatest tragedy in Dorian's story is how he will be remembered. I very much doubt that the lasting legacy of Dorian Gray will be the portrait, but rather what people found lying on the floor in front of it.